The clinking of silverware faded into a deafening silence as Bella slid the heavy crystal tumbler across the immaculate white linen. Her hand trembled just a fraction of an inch as her pale fingers brushed the cocktail napkin beneath it. Written in frantic, jagged ink on the underside was a single, desperate warning: "Don't drink it." She turned to walk away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, praying she could simply disappear. But before she could take a single step, a hand shot out. Fingers like steel clamped vice-like around her fragile wrist. Thomas didn't look at the note. He didn't look at the amber liquid. His dark, unreadable eyes locked instantly onto her terrified face. "What exactly?" he murmured, his voice a lethal velvet. "Did you just serve me?" The Obsidian Room was less a restaurant and more a sanctuary for the city's untouchables. It was a cavern of calculated indulgence, where the lighting was perpetually dimmed to the color of bruised plums, designed specifically to hide the sins of the elite behind long shadows and the soft, suffocating hum of a live jazz quartet. Bella's feet throbbed in perfect, agonizing rhythm with the upright bass. It was her 14th consecutive hour on shift, a brutal double that had left her uniform smelling faintly of garlic, spilled vermouth, and her own nervous sweat. She was exhausted, practically sleepwalking through the maze of mahogany tables. But in a place like this, invisibility was the ultimate goal. You served, you smiled, you vanished. Tonight, however, the air felt thicker than usual, charged with an invisible, suffocating static. Bella had felt it the moment the three men in tailored charcoal grey suits had commandeered the secluded corner booth near the kitchen swing doors. They didn't look like the usual corporate vultures or corrupt politicians. They moved with a predatory stillness, their eyes constantly scanning the room, calculating exits and sightlines. Bella had been restocking the polished silver cutlery at the waiter's station when she heard it. A whisper, barely audible over the clatter of plates, but sharp enough to slice through the ambient noise. The moment it touches his lips, it's done. 3 minutes, max. His heart stops. Looks like a massive coronary. The paramedics won't even find a trace. Bella had frozen, her fingers gripping a cold butter knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. She risked a terrifying, split-second glance through the gap in the privacy screen. One of the men, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, was holding a tiny, innocuous glass vial. It was no larger than a pinky finger, filled with a liquid so clear it looked like innocent rainwater. As she watched, paralyzed by a sudden spike of primal fear, the man smoothly tipped the vial over a freshly poured glass of aged bourbon, Thomas's usual drink. The liquid vanished into the amber alcohol without a single ripple, leaving no trace of the death it now carried. She knew who Thomas was. Everyone in the city, from the highest judges to the lowest street sweepers, knew the name, even if they never dared to speak it loudly. He was the architect of the city's underworld, a man who ruled with a chilling, bloodless efficiency. He wasn't a screaming, violent thug. He was a ghost, a myth made of bespoke suits and terrifying absolute power. Bella despised everything men like him stood for. They were the reason her neighborhood was falling apart, the reason her brother had gotten caught up in loans he could never repay. Yet, as she stood there gripping the butter knife, a sickening wave of moral nausea washed over her. She was looking at a murder in progress. It didn't matter what Thomas had done or how many lives he had ruined. Standing by and watching a man be poisoned to death, feeling the complicity seep into her own soul, was something she fundamentally could not do. The bartender, oblivious to the lethal addition, placed the heavy crystal tumbler on her tray. "Table 7. "The boss," he muttered, wiping down the mahogany counter. "Don't spill it, Bella, or he might buy the restaurant just to fire you." Bella stared at the glass. The amber liquid caught the dim light, glowing with a malevolent warmth. Her mind raced, violently oscillating between self-preservation and a stubborn, blinding sense of right and wrong. If she warned him, she exposed herself to the men who had poisoned the drink. They would kill her. If she said nothing, she would carry the weight of a man's final gasping breaths for the rest of her life. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She snatched a cocktail napkin from the caddy, grabbed the pen she kept tucked behind her ear, and scribbled the 3 words in frantic, shaking handwriting. "Don't drink it." She placed the napkin face down on the silver tray, set the poisoned bourbon meticulously on top of it, and lifted the tray. It felt as heavy as a lead anvil. Every step toward table 7 was an agonizing eternity. The jazz music seemed to distort, warping into a mocking, discordant wail. She could feel the eyes of the 3 men in the corner booth burning into her spine, tracking her progress. She kept her eyes fixed on the gleaming surface of Thomas's table. Thomas sat alone, an island of terrifying calm in the center of the bustling room. He was dressed in a midnight blue suit that probably cost more than Bella made in 2 years. His dark hair was impeccably styled, but it was his face that arrested her sharp, aristocratic features carved from pale stone, and eyes that held the cold, unfathomable depth of a freezing ocean. He was reading a leather-bound menu, seemingly relaxed, but Bella noticed the slight tension in his broad shoulders, the way his left hand rested lightly on his thigh, perfectly positioned to reach inside his jacket. She reached the table, her breath hitched in her throat. She set the napkin down, ensuring the blank side faced up, and placed the heavy glass squarely in the center. She didn't dare make eye contact. She simply wanted to pivot on her aching feet and flee to the kitchen, to hide in the walk-in freezer until the screaming started. But as she turned, intending to slip away into the comforting anonymity of the crowded floor, that was when the trap sprang. That was when his hand shot out, a blur of motion too fast to track, and his steel fingers clamped around her wrist. The heat of his hand seared through the thin, cheap fabric of Bella's uniform sleeve. It wasn't just a physical restraint. It was an anchor plunging her violently into a world she had spent her entire life desperately avoiding. "What exactly?" Thomas murmured, his voice low, melodic, and terrifyingly calm. "Did you just serve me?" Bella's heart slammed against her ribs with enough force to crack bone. She couldn't breathe. She stared down at his long, elegant fingers, wrapped completely around her wrist. He wasn't crushing her bones, but the implication of absolute, unbreakable power was clear. If she pulled away, she knew instinctually that he would snap her arm without changing his facial expression. Bella stammered, her throat suddenly dry as dust. It's your bourbon, sir." Thomas didn't blink. His dark eyes methodically searched her face, mapping every microscopic twitch of her facial muscles, the dilation of her pupils, the frantic flutter of the pulse point at the base of her neck. He was a man who had survived for 40 years by reading the unspoken truths of killers and liars. Reading a terrified waitress was effortless. "You are lying," he stated simply. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation of fact. He slowly, deliberately slid his other hand across the table, his fingertips brushing the rim of the crystal glass. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he slid the glass a few inches to the right, revealing the cocktail napkin beneath. With agonizing slowness, he flipped the napkin over. The jagged, frantic words, "Don't drink it," screamed up at him from the white paper. For a fraction of a second, something flared in the absolute void of his eyes. Not fear, never fear. It was a cold, calculating shift in tactical awareness. He realized instantly that the perimeter of his safety had been breached. The fortress was compromised. He didn't look around the room. Doing so would immediately signal to his would-be assassins that their plot had been discovered. He kept his gaze locked entirely on Bella, maintaining the illusion of a man reprimanding clumsy staff. "Sit down," he commanded. The velvet tone was gone, replaced by a serrated edge of command. I have other tables," Bella whispered, tears of sheer terror prickling the corners of her eyes. "My manager." Thomas's grip tightened, just enough to send a sharp jolt of warning up her forearm. "Sit." Now, Bella's knees gave way before her mind consciously decided to obey. She practically collapsed into the plush leather chair opposite him. She felt exposed, entirely naked beneath the soft, dim lighting of the restaurant. Across the room, she could feel the heavy, expectant stares of the three men in the corner booth. They were waiting for Thomas to raise the glass. They were waiting for him to die. "Who?" Thomas asked, his voice barely louder than a breath. "Put you up to this?" "No one," Bella choked out, keeping her voice equally low, desperate not to draw attention. "I swear, I was getting silverware. I heard them. 3 men. Corner booth by the kitchen. They put something in it. Clear liquid. They said it stops your heart in 3 minutes. Thomas's face remained a mask of flawless marble. He digested the information with terrifying speed. He didn't doubt her. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her small frame was impossible to fake. A rival faction had infiltrated his sanctuary, bypassed his security, and compromised the staff. "Why didn't you just walk away?" he asked, a flicker of genuine clinical curiosity cutting through his cold demeanor. "If you know who I am, you know what I do. Why risk your life to save mine?" Bella stared at him, her chest heaving. The absurdity of the situation hit her. Here she was, a girl who struggled to pay rent on a damp, one-bedroom apartment, sitting across from a billionaire crime lord, debating morality while assassins watched them from 50 feet away. "Because," she whispered fiercely, a sudden, inexplicable spark of anger momentarily overriding her fear. "I don't get to decide who lives and dies. I couldn't watch it happen. Now, please, let me go." Thomas studied her. She was remarkably plain in this environment. No heavy makeup, no expensive jewelry, just pale skin, wide brown eyes, and hair pulled back into a messy bun. Yet, there was an incandescent stubbornness in her jawline that fascinated him. She was a liability. She was a witness. In his world, witnesses were loose ends that needed to be severed. But she had also just handed him his life. He slowly released her wrist. Bella immediately pulled her arm back, cradling it against her chest as if she had been burned. "You can't leave," Thomas said softly, finally shifting his gaze to the poisoned glass. "If you walk away now, they will know you warned me. You won't make it to the end of the block. They will drag you into an alley and silence you to cover their tracks." Bella's breath caught. The spark of anger vanished, replaced instantly by the crushing weight of reality. He was right. She had painted a target on her own back the moment she picked up the pen. What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. Thomas finally smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips that didn't reach his freezing eyes. "We do exactly what they expect. We put on a show." He reached inside his tailored jacket, a movement so smooth and practiced it was almost hypnotic, and withdrew a sleek, black smartphone. He typed a single letter and hit send. "Take a deep breath, Bella," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair, suddenly projecting an aura of relaxed amusement. "The room is about to get very loud." The transition from hushed elegance to absolute chaos took exactly 4 seconds. It began not with a shout or a gunshot, but with the subtle, synchronized movement of 4 men who had been sitting at seemingly random tables throughout the obsidian room. These were Thomas's shadows, his personal guard, dressed as diners, businessmen, and patrons. At the silent command from his phone, they rose as one fluid entity. In the corner booth, the man with the scarred eyebrow recognized the shift in the room's atmosphere a fraction of a second too late. He realized Thomas hadn't touched the drink. He realized the waitress was still sitting there. His hand dove toward the interior of his jacket. "Down," Thomas barked, no longer bothering to conceal his voice. He didn't wait for Bella to react. He lunged across the small table, his heavy shoulder slamming into her chest, driving her backward. Her chair tipped, and they crashed to the plush carpeted floor in a tangle of limbs, the linen tablecloth dragging down with them, shattering the poisoned crystal tumbler in a splash of lethal amber fluid just inches from her face. The deafening crack of a suppressed gunshot punched through the jazz music. The upright bass player screamed, dropping his instrument with a hollow, resonant thud. Above them, the restaurant erupted into a frenzy of screaming patrons, shattering glass, and overturning tables. Bella squeezed her eyes shut, clapping her hands over her ears, curling into a tight, trembling ball beneath the suffocating weight of Thomas's body. He was entirely shielding her, his broad back absorbing the brunt of falling debris. "Stay low," he commanded in her ear, his voice startlingly calm amidst the shrieking mayhem. "Do exactly what I say, when I say it." He rolled off her, crouching low in the debris of shattered china and spilled wine. He drew a weapon from an ankle holster, a compact, terrifyingly efficient black pistol. Bella stared at it, the reality of the violence crashing over her in suffocating waves. This wasn't a movie. Men were trying to kill them, right now, in the restaurant where she polished silverware. "Move." Thomas grabbed the back of her uniform collar and hauled her to her feet, staying hunched over. He didn't run wildly. He moved with a brutal, calculated geometry, using thick mahogany pillars and overturned heavy oak tables as cover. 2 more suppressed shots ripped through the air, puffing dust from the pillar just inches from Thomas's head. He didn't flinch. He aimed, fired twice in rapid succession, and a heavy body crashed into a nearby table with a sickening crunch. Bella sobbed, a sound torn from the deepest part of her throat, stumbling over a dropped purse. Thomas caught her under the arm, physically dragging her forward. "Kitchen. Now," he ordered, pulling her toward the swinging doors. They burst through into the blinding fluorescent glare of the commercial kitchen. The chefs and prep cooks had already scattered, abandoning simmering pots and half-chopped vegetables. The air was thick with the smell of searing meat and burnt butter. Thomas shoved her behind a massive stainless steel preparation island. "Keep your head down." The kitchen doors slammed open. 2 of the assassins rushed in, weapons raised. Thomas was waiting. The violence was fast, clinical, and horrifyingly quiet. He stepped out from behind the steel island, moving with the terrifying grace of a predator. 2 precise shots. The metallic ting of empty casings hitting the tiled floor. The 2 men collapsed in a tangle of limbs and blood. Bella clamped her hands over her mouth to trap a scream, her whole body shaking violently. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look at the bodies sprawling on the pristine white tiles. "Look at me," Thomas commanded. His hand was on her face, his thumb forcefully tilting her chin up. His eyes were blazing now, fully alive, burning with a violent energy. "Look at me, Bella. Do not look at them. You are going to walk out the back door with me. You are not going to freeze. Do you understand?" She nodded numbly, terrified by the blood on his cuff, terrified by the casual way he held the weapon, terrified by the fact that he was currently the safest thing in the world. He grabbed her hand, interlocking his fingers with hers, and pulled her toward the rear exit, the heavy steel door that led to the alley. He slammed his shoulder into the panic bar, and the door burst open into the cold, driving rain of the city night. The alley was pitch black, smelling of damp garbage and ozone. A massive, armor-plated black SUV was already idling violently at the end of the brick corridor, its tires spinning slightly on the wet pavement. The rear door was flung open by a man in a tactical vest. "Get in," Thomas ordered, physically lifting Bella off her feet and shoving her into the cavernous, leather-scented interior of the vehicle. He threw himself in right behind her. "Drive." Now, the SUV surged forward with the roaring force of a jet engine, slamming Bella back against the plush leather seats. She curled her knees to her chest, shivering uncontrollably, completely soaked from the few seconds in the rain. She looked across the dark cabin at Thomas. He was systematically ejecting the magazine from his pistol, checking the chamber, his face illuminated only by the passing, rhythmic flashes of orange streetlights. He hadn't just saved his own life, he had kidnapped her, and as the SUV tore through the rain-slicked streets, leaving her entire life behind, Bella realized she had absolutely no idea where they were going. The ride was a blur of high-speed turns, the rhythmic thwap-thwap of windshield wipers, and a silence so profound it felt heavy enough to crush her. Bella huddled in the corner of the expansive back seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the restaurant was crashing hard, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her bones and a nauseating wave of terror. She covertly watched Thomas. He was engaged in a rapid, low-voiced phone conversation, speaking in clipped, coded sentences. Compromised, Level 4. Initiate the purge protocol. Find out who paid the hitters before they bleed out. He sounded less like a man who had just narrowly escaped death, and more like a CEO managing a hostile corporate takeover. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 40 minutes, the SUV descended into a stark, brightly lit subterranean parking garage. The vehicle slid to a halt in front of a private, reinforced steel elevator. "Out," Thomas said, pocketing his phone. Bella scrambled out, her legs trembling so badly they almost gave out beneath her. The air in the garage was cold and smelled of concrete and expensive exhaust. Thomas placed a hand firmly on the small of her back, a gesture that felt simultaneously protective and possessive, and guided her into the elevator. He pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner, and the car shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. When the doors parted, Bella blinked against the sudden, warm light. They stepped into a penthouse that looked like it had been carved out of a modern art museum. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the glittering city skyline below. The floors were polished dark wood, the furniture angular and impossibly expensive, rendered in shades of slate, cream, and chrome. It was beautiful, immaculate, and utterly devoid of anything resembling human warmth. "Sit," Thomas pointed to a massive, low-slung white sofa. Bella obeyed, perching on the very edge of the cushions. Her cheap, stain-resistant uniform left a small damp patch on the pristine fabric. She felt like a stray dog, dragged into a palace. Thomas walked over to a sleek, mirrored bar cart. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid, not from a poisoned vial, but from a heavy crystal decanter, and threw it back in one smooth, practiced motion. He poured a glass of water and carried it over, setting it on the glass table in front of her. "Drink," he instructed. She picked up the glass with both hands, her fingers shaking so violently the water rippled. She took a small sip. It was freezing cold and grounded her slightly. Thomas took off his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over a chair, revealing a dark, tailored dress shirt and the leather harness of his shoulder holster. He pulled a heavy armchair opposite the sofa and sat down, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He studied her with that same intense, unsettling scrutiny. "Let's talk," he said softly. "I want to go home," Bella whispered, her voice cracking. "Please." I didn't see anything. I won't say anything. I just want to go back to my apartment. You can't go back to your apartment, Thomas replied, his tone devoid of sympathy, stating only harsh, unyielding facts. The men who tried to kill me aren't street thugs. They are professionals. By now, they have your face from the restaurant's security cameras. They have your name from the employee roster. They know where you live. If you walk through your front door tonight, you will be dead before sunrise. A sob tore out of Bella's throat. She buried her face in her hands, the reality of her ruined life finally crushing her. Why? She cried out, the injustice of it all burning hot in her chest. I didn't do anything. I just served a stupid drink. No, Thomas corrected quietly. You saved my life, and in doing so, you chose a side in a war you didn't even know existed. He watched her cry for a long moment. There was no pity in his eyes, but there was a strange, analytical curiosity. In his world, every action was transactional. Loyalty was bought, betrayal was punished, and survival was the only metric of success. Selfless acts of morality were non-existent. They were a myth. I asked you at the restaurant, and I want a real answer now, Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, demanding absolute truth. You knew who I was. You knew I am a man who has ordered the deaths of others. You knew the risks. So why, Bella? Why did you write that note? Bella slowly lowered her hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears, but as she looked at him, the fear was momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, stubborn defiance. Because I am not you, she said, her voice shaking but surprisingly loud in the cavernous room. I know what you are. I know what you do. But if I stood there and watched you drink poison, knowing I could stop it, then I become a murderer too. I become like you. And I would rather be dead than be like you. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. The city lights glittered below them, millions of oblivious lives carrying on in the dark. Thomas didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared at the exhausted, terrified, minimum-wage waitress who had just insulted him to his face in his own fortress. For a man accustomed to absolute deference and cowering fear, her raw, bleeding honesty was like a physical blow. Slowly, incredibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of genuine, profound respect. Well, Thomas murmured, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. It seems I have finally met someone in this city who isn't for sale. You're staying here, Bella, until I find the men who did this and erase them from the earth. You are under my protection now, whether you want it or not. The next 48 hours dissolved into a surreal, agonizing purgatory. The penthouse, despite its breathtaking views and absurd luxury, became Bella's gilded cage. She was permitted to move freely within the massive apartment, but the heavy steel door leading to the elevator remained firmly locked, guarded from the outside. Thomas rarely slept. He transformed the dining room into a war room. He paced the length of the long mahogany table, a Bluetooth earpiece permanently lodged in his ear, his voice a low, constant rumble of lethal commands. Bella watched him from the periphery, a silent ghost haunting his immaculate space. She saw the empire of Thomas laid bare not in blood and violence, but in logistics, bribery, blackmail, and ruthless, terrifying intelligence. She learned quickly that the assassination attempt wasn't a strike from a rival cartel. It was a mutiny. Someone high up within his own organization, someone he trusted, had sold him out. The paranoia in the apartment was a palpable, suffocating fog. Thomas trusted no one on the phone. He was systematically dismantling his own infrastructure to find the rot. On the third night, the relentless pace finally began to show. Bella was sitting in the kitchen at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, staring blankly at a cup of herbal tea. Thomas walked in. The sharp, immaculate aura of the mob boss was gone. His dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and dusted with dark hair. He looked hollowed out, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. He didn't say a word. He walked to the massive stainless steel refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and leaned heavily against the marble counter, closing his eyes. He looked, for the first time, profoundly human. He looked utterly exhausted. Bella watched him, her fear momentarily overridden by a strange, instinctive empathy. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster carrying the weight of a crumbling world on his shoulders. She stood up, walked to the counter, and quietly poured a second mug of hot water. She placed a tea bag in it, chamomile, the only thing she had found that calmed her own shattered nerves, and pushed it gently across the marble toward him. Thomas opened his eyes, looking down at the steaming mug, and then up at her. The silence stretched between them, thick and complicated. "It's not poisoned," Bella said softly, a dark, ironic humor bleeding into her voice. Thomas let out a short, rough sound that might have been a laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound. He picked up the mug, letting the heat sink into his hands. "My second in command," Thomas said abruptly, his voice hoarse. He stared off into the middle distance, speaking to the air as much as to her. "A man named Silas. I pulled him out of the gutter 20 years ago. I taught him everything. I made him rich. He's the one who bought the poison." Bella didn't know what to say. The magnitude of the betrayal hung heavy in the air. "Why?" she asked simply. "Power," Thomas replied, taking a sip of the bitter tea. "It is a disease, Bella. It infects the blood. It makes men forget who they are, who fed them." He realized I was never going to step down, so he decided to expedite my retirement. He looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away her defenses. "You said you didn't want to be like me. You don't want to decide who lives and dies." He set the mug down. "What happens when someone you love, someone you trust with your life, decides you need to die? What do your morals tell you to do then?" "I don't know," Bella admitted honestly, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. "But I know that killing him will just make you emptier. It won't fix the betrayal. It just creates a void." Thomas stepped closer to her. The physical proximity made her heart accelerate, but she forced herself to stand her ground. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before his fingers gently brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he commanded. "You are a terrifying creature, Bella," he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. "You look at the darkness and demand it turns on a light. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be anywhere near me." "Then let me go," she whispered, her breath hitching at his proximity. "I can't," he said, the mask of the ruthless boss sliding back over his face, hardening his features. "Because Silas knows I survived. And he knows a waitress helped me. You are the only leverage he has left. As long as you are alive, you are a target. And as long as you are with me, I have a reason to burn his entire world to the ground." Before Bella could process the terrifying weight of his words, the apartment was plunged into absolute, blinding darkness. The hum of the refrigerator died. The glow of the city lights outside the windows was suddenly the only illumination, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. Thomas reacted instantly. His hand clamped onto her arm, hauling her flush against his chest, pulling her down below the level of the marble counter. "The power grid for the building has been cut," he whispered harshly in her ear, drawing his pistol in a smooth, silent motion. "They found us." The silence that followed the blackout was more terrifying than any explosion. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of hunters stalking prey. Bella knelt on the cold kitchen floor, her face pressed against Thomas's shoulder. She could feel the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart against her cheek. It wasn't racing. He was operating in a state of hyper-focused calm. "Listen to me very carefully," Thomas breathed, his lips barely moving against her ear. "There are only two ways up here. The private elevator, which they just disabled, and the emergency stairwell. They will breach the stairwell door in roughly 40 seconds. When they do, this room is going to become very loud and very bright." He reached behind his back and withdrew a small, heavy object, pressing it into her trembling hands. It was a spare, loaded magazine for his pistol. The cold steel felt like ice against her skin. "I have 15 rounds in the weapon," he said, his voice a metronome of control. "When I fire the 15th shot, the slide will lock back. I will drop the empty magazine. You will hand me that one. Do not drop it. Do you understand?" "I can't," Bella whimpered, tears of sheer panic flooding her eyes. "Thomas, I can't do this." He gripped her chin tightly, forcing her to look at the faint outline of his face in the dark. "You can. You are stronger than you think. You saved my life once. I need you to do it again. Focus on the magazine, nothing else." A faint, metallic scraping sound echoed from the far end of the hallway, the heavy emergency stairwell door being forced open. Thomas released her chin and pivoted, resting his forearms on the marble counter, aiming into the gloom of the living room. Click, hiss. 3 blinding beams of tactical flashlights pierced the darkness, sweeping across the modern furniture. Searching, the men were wearing night vision goggles, moving with trained, military precision. Thomas didn't wait for them to find the kitchen. He opened fire. The sound was catastrophic in the enclosed space. The muzzle flashes strobe-lit the kitchen in harsh bursts of orange and yellow, casting monstrous shadows against the walls. Bella curled into a ball, pressing her hands over her ears, screaming silently into her knees. The air instantly filled with the acrid, choking smell of cordite and pulverized drywall as the assassins returned fire. The heavy marble counter above them exploded into shards of stone as bullets chewed into it. 3, 4, 5. Thomas was counting his shots out loud, his voice cutting through the deafening roar of gunfire. He was shifting positions constantly, using the counter for cover, firing with terrifying accuracy. Bella heard a heavy thud, followed by a scream of pain from the living room. 1 down, 10, 11, 12. The counter shuddered violently as a sustained burst of automatic fire ripped through the cabinetry next to them. Glass shattered somewhere in the darkness. 14, 15. The gunfire from Thomas stopped abruptly. The slide of his pistol locked back with a sharp metallic clack. He slammed his palm against the grip, ejecting the empty magazine. It clattered onto the tile floor next to Bella. "Magazine!" Thomas roared. Bella's mind was entirely blank, paralyzed by fear. But muscle memory, drilled into her by his intense command just moments before, took over. She thrust her hand upward, blindly offering the heavy block of steel and brass. Thomas snatched it from her grasp. Click! Clack! The slide racked forward. He surged upward again, resuming the firefight with ruthless efficiency. A moment later, a sudden, agonizing grunt tore from his throat. He dropped heavily back to the floor beside her, his hand clutching his left shoulder. In the dim light from the window, Bella saw the dark, wet stain rapidly spreading across his shirt. Panic, absolute and primal, finally shattered her paralysis. She scrambled toward him, her hands hovering over his bleeding shoulder. "You're hit. Oh God, you're hit. It's a through and through. Meat wound," he gritted out, his breath hissing through his teeth. He grabbed her arm with his good hand. "We can't hold them here. They have suppressing fire. We need to move." "Move where?" "We're on the 40th floor. "The maintenance shaft," Thomas said, struggling to his feet, pulling her up with him. "Behind the pantry. It drops down to the service levels." He laid down a blind barrage of cover fire into the living room, shattering a massive vase and forcing the remaining attackers behind the sofa. "Run!" he yelled, shoving Bella toward the pantry. They sprinted through the swinging doors, slipping on spilled flour and shattered glass. Thomas slammed his shoulder against a false panel in the back of the shelving unit. It popped open, revealing a dark, vertical shaft lined with a rusted iron ladder. "Climb," he ordered, his voice strained with pain. "Don't stop until you hit the bottom." Bella threw herself onto the ladder, the rough iron biting into her palms, and began to descend into the pitch blackness. She could hear Thomas climbing down heavily above her, his breathing ragged, his blood dripping steadily into the dark abyss below. They were descending into the bowels of the city, leaving the gilded cage behind. Trading one nightmare for another, they emerged into a subterranean labyrinth of steam pipes and dripping concrete, the forgotten mechanical underbelly of the high-rise. Thomas moved sluggishly now, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, his face pale and slick with cold sweat in the dim emergency lighting. He led them through a maze of maintenance tunnels that eventually dumped them out into a rain-soaked, garbage-strewn alley several blocks away from the compromised tower. A beat-up, unassuming gray sedan was parked half on the sidewalk. Thomas stumbled toward it, fishing keys from his pocket with a trembling hand. "Get in the back," he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't drive fast this time. He drove with excruciating care, blending into the sparse, late-night city traffic. The majestic, terrifying mob boss was gone. In his place was a bleeding, exhausted man, fighting to stay conscious. They drove for an hour, deep into the industrial outskirts of the city, pulling up to a motel that looked like it had been rotting since the 1980s. The neon sign buzzed and flickered. Half the letters burned out. Thomas paid the terrified clerk in cash, grabbed a key, and practically dragged himself into room 114. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach. The carpet was a depressing shade of rust. He collapsed onto the edge of the lumpy mattress, his head dropping into his hands. "Lock the door. Draw the blinds." Bella moved on autopilot, securing the room. When she turned around, Thomas was struggling to peel the bloody, ruined dress shirt off his shoulder. He hissed in pain, his face turning an ashen gray. "Let me," Bella said. Her fear of him had completely vanished, replaced by a strange, commanding focus. She was used to cleaning up messes, fixing things that were broken. She went to the tiny, grimy bathroom, found a threadbare towel, and soaked it in hot water. She returned to the bed and gently pushed his good hand away. She carefully peeled the fabric back, revealing the bullet wound. He was right. The bullet had passed clean through the meaty part of his shoulder, missing the bone, but it was bleeding heavily. "This is going to hurt," she warned softly. "Do it," he breathed. She pressed the hot towel hard against the wound. Thomas's entire body went rigid, his jaw locked, the muscles in his neck cording like steel wire, but he didn't make a sound. Bella applied continuous pressure, kneeling on the floor between his legs to get better leverage, her face inches from his chest. For 10 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the buzzing of the neon sign outside and the ragged, syncopated rhythm of their breathing. Slowly, the bleeding began to slow. Bella removed the towel, tearing a strip from the clean bottom hem of her uniform shirt, and bound the wound tightly. When she finally tied the knot, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. She looked up. Thomas was watching her. The adrenaline had faded, leaving them both stripped bare in the dingy motel light. The immense power dynamic that usually separated them had collapsed. They were just two damaged people in a cheap room, covered in blood. "Why are you doing this, Bella?" Thomas asked softly. the velvet back in his voice but stripped of its usual lethal edge. It sounded intensely vulnerable. "You could have run when we were in the tunnels. You could have left me in the alley. I was too weak to stop you." Bella stared at her blood-stained hands. "I told you, I don't leave people to die. Not even you." Thomas reached out with his good hand. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smear of dirt and blood from her skin. The touch sent a violent, confusing shiver down her spine. It was a touch meant to comfort, not control. "You are a terrifying liability in my world," Thomas whispered, leaning forward, closing the distance between them. "Your goodness is a weakness that men like Silas will exploit to tear me apart. You make me care about things I cannot afford to care about." "Then let me go," she whispered back, staring into his dark eyes, unable to pull away from the magnetic pull of his gaze. "When this is over, let me walk away." Thomas's eyes darkened with a complex, agonizing emotion. "That is the tragedy of this, Bella," he murmured, his forehead resting gently against hers. "If I let you walk away, I have to go back into the dark alone. And after seeing the light, I don't know if I can survive the dark anymore." For a long, suspended moment, the air crackled with a dangerous, unspoken tension. Bella felt a desperate, terrifying urge to lean in, to close the final fraction of an inch and kiss the monster who had become her protector. Before she could surrender to the impulse, Thomas pulled back, the physical distance severing the spell. His face hardened, the ruthless boss returning to the surface. "Get some sleep," he commanded, standing up abruptly, turning his back to her. "Tomorrow, Silas dies, and then I will figure out what to do with you." Dawn broke like a bruised eye over the industrial district, washing the dingy motel room in a sickly grey light. Bella woke up curled tightly on the edge of the lumpy bed. The room was empty. Panic seized her throat. She shot up, her eyes scanning the small space. Thomas's bloody shirt was in the trash. The keys to the sedan were gone. On the small, chipped nightstand sat a thick envelope, a burner phone, and a note written in sharp, precise handwriting. "Stay inside. Do not answer the door. If the phone rings, it means I am dead. Open the envelope and run." He had left her. He had gone to face Silas alone, wounded and outnumbered, walking into a suicidal confrontation to protect her, to end the war so she could finally be free. A cold fury ignited in Bella's chest. For 3 days, she had been dragged, terrified and helpless, through a world of violence. She had hidden in shadows and bled for a war she didn't understand. She looked at the envelope, heavy with the promise of a new, lonely life bought with blood money. "No," she said aloud, the word dropping like a stone into the silence of the room. She grabbed the burner phone and stormed out of the motel. The sedan was gone, but she knew where he went. During his feverish planning in the penthouse, he had mentioned a shipping yard on the docks, Silas's primary staging ground for smuggling operations. She flagged down a battered taxi on the main road, shoving a $100 bill from the envelope at the driver. "Pier 44. Drive fast." The docks were a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and towering cranes, smelling of salt, diesel, and decaying fish. The taxi dropped her off at the perimeter gate. Bella slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, running blindly into the maze of steel boxes, her cheap shoes slipping on the wet asphalt. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a weapon. She only knew she couldn't let him die alone in the dark. Gunfire erupted, echoing sharply off the metal containers. It wasn't the chaotic roar of a firefight. It was calculated, rhythmic execution. Bella sprinted toward the sound, rounding a massive red container, and stumbled into a clearing. It was a slaughterhouse. 6 men lay motionless on the wet ground. In the center of the clearing stood Thomas. He was covered in grime, blood seeping through the fresh bandage on his shoulder. His face a mask of absolute, terrifying rage. He held his pistol leveled steadily at the head of a man kneeling in the puddles before him. The kneeling man was Silas. He was bleeding from a gut wound, his hands raised in a desperate, trembling gesture of surrender. "You're old, Thomas." Silas spat, blood bubbling on his lips. "You're soft. You let a waitress, a nobody, dictate your moves. You brought this on yourself." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. His eyes were dead, vacant voids of pure executioner's logic. He was about to pull the trigger. He was about to cross the line back into the monster Bella despised. "Thomas!" Bella's scream ripped through the silence of the docks. Thomas flinched, the pistol wavering for a fraction of a second. He snapped his head toward her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. "Bella, get out of here!" In that split second of distraction, Silas lunged. He didn't go for Thomas. He lunged toward a dropped weapon in the mud. "No!" Thomas roared. He didn't fire at Silas. He threw his body sideways, diving directly into the line of fire, placing himself entirely between Silas and Bella, just as Silas raised the muddy weapon and fired blindly. A heavy, sickening impact shuddered through Thomas's body. He collapsed hard onto the wet asphalt, his weapon skittering away. Silas scrambled to his feet, aiming the gun at Bella, a bloody grin splitting his face. "Looks like you both die too." A single, deafening shot rang out. Silas's head snapped back violently. His weapon dropped, and he crumpled to the ground. Dead before he hit the mud, Bella stood frozen, trembling violently. Behind where Silas had stood, one of Thomas's shadow guards, a man she recognized from the restaurant, lowered a sniper rifle from the top of a shipping container. The cavalry had arrived, seconds too late. Bella dropped to her knees beside Thomas. He was lying on his back, staring up at the gray sky, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Blood was pooling rapidly beneath his side. "Thomas," she sobbed, pressing her hands desperately against the new wound, her tears mixing with the rain and blood on his face. "Why did you do that? Why did you jump?" He looked at her, the cold, ruthless boss entirely gone. He was just a man, fragile and dying, looking at the only good thing he had touched in decades. He reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand, his fingers tangling weakly in her hair. He pulled her down, his lips brushing against her ear. "Because," he whispered, his voice fading into the sound of the rain, "I couldn't let the light go out." His eyes closed, his hand falling limply to the wet pavement. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. It had been 2 weeks since the docks, 2 weeks of surgeries, of men in dark suits standing guard at the door, of Bella sitting in a plastic chair, watching the slow, agonizing rise and fall of Thomas's chest on the ventilator. He had survived. The bullet had missed his vital organs by millimeters, but the blood loss had nearly killed him. Today, he was awake. He was sitting up, propped against a bank of pillows, looking pale and diminished, but the lethal intelligence had returned to his dark eyes. Bella stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. She was wearing new clothes, expensive, neutral tones provided by his fixers. The waitress uniform was gone, burned along with her old life. "The envelope," Thomas said, his voice raspy but steady. Bella turned around. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the thick envelope he had left at the motel. She walked over and placed it gently on the pristine white sheets covering his lap. "It's a new identity," Thomas explained, not touching it. "Passports, a house in Florence, enough money to ensure you never have to work another double shift in your life. It's clean, untraceable." Bella stared at the envelope. It was freedom. It was everything she had ever wanted. handed to her by the man she had come to both fear and, in some profound, terrified way, love. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "Silas is dead. His faction is eradicated," Thomas said, his face hardening into the familiar mask of the mob boss. "I have to rebuild. I have to re-establish control. I have to go back to the dark." He looked at her, his eyes dropping to the envelope, and then back up to her face. The vulnerability she had seen at the motel, on the docks, was locked away behind a vault of necessary cruelty. He was making a choice. He was choosing to save her by pushing her away. "If you stay," Thomas said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, "I will corrupt you. I will drag you down into the blood and the dirt until you are just as hollow as I am. You will become a target again. You will watch me do terrible things, and eventually you will stop caring. I won't let that happen to you." Tears welled in Bella's eyes. She knew he was right. She couldn't live in his world, and he couldn't survive in hers. They were two parallel lines, violently forced to intersect for a brief, bloody moment, destined to diverge forever. She reached out and placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away, but he didn't grasp it either. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold steel of his grip that very first night. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For my life, thank you," Thomas replied quietly, his eyes locked onto hers with a devastating intensity. "For my soul." Bella picked up the envelope. She didn't look back as she walked to the door. She knew if she turned around, if she saw him watching her leave, she would never have the strength to walk through it. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sounding like a final, unyielding gunshot. Thomas sat alone in the quiet room. He looked at his empty hand, feeling the phantom warmth of her touch lingering on his skin. He reached for his phone on the bedside table, dialing a number from memory. "It's me," he said, his voice cold, hollow, and absolute. "Assemble the capos. We have work to do." He hung up, staring blankly at the wall. He had his empire back. He had his life. But as the shadows lengthened in the quiet hospital room, Thomas knew, with crushing absolute certainty, that he had never been more dead. Doing the right thing rarely grants us a fairy tale ending. Often, it costs us our peace, our safety, and sometimes the very people we learn to love. Bella saved a monster and kept her humanity, while Thomas found a soul only to realize he had to sacrifice it to protect her. True morality is a heavy, isolating burden, but it is the only thing that separates us from the darkness. If this story gripped your heart, please drop a like, share it with someone who appreciates intense drama, and subscribe for more deep cinematic narratives.